Today, my purpose was to be inform my audience about school violence, its history, and best practices. What were you doing April 16, 2007, December 14, 2012, or May 24th, 2022? I know April 16, 2007, I was training in the United States Army. December 14th, 2012, I was barely figuring life out after the Army. May 24th, 2022, I was cruising and vacationing in Cabo, Mexico. While we were living and going about our day-to-day lives, students, teachers, families, and law enforcement were having the worst day of their life. My goal is to inform you about the history of school violence, best practices, and how emotional, mental well-being factor into school violence. The history in school violence has plagued students since the mid-19th century, and I didn't even know that. I just thought, school and gun violence was something that was only, occurring in the 2000s, not in the mid-19th century. And we know that has been occurring until today. Arguably, the well-being and mental health of a student plays a huge role in prevention. The history of school shootings in itself and its reoccurrence tell us a lot. One can easily correlate the increase in shootings to mental health. We all know alone that today social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok greatly affect our youth right now. There are lawsuits going on as we speak regarding mental health, and many have won. It's causing greater depression. It's increasing violence visually to students or even our youth at a young age so that they're predisposed to violence. Primarily our music also is saturated with violence. And not to say that, that we can't handle it or, it's just that everyone is affected differently. So yes, I believe that the tragedies in Uvalde, Texas, Sandy Hook Elementary, and Virginia Tech changed public and private education worldwide. It changed how we feel as parents. It changed how we feel as Americans, how you feel as an aunt, an uncle, how you feel as an educator or teacher, the risk you have to take now becoming a teacher, what you have to consider and the factors involved in that. Including law enforcement, the training had to change to include this after that. We had to start training our students in school shooter alarms or drills. So, I would also, right now I would like to focus on school violence and its history in our country, in America. Since the first school shooting that happened January 10th in 2000, as I stated before, school shootings have, been going and occurring since the mid-19th century until now, 2026. The first documented school shooting was January 10th in 2000. Now, I could show you a list of, and it was sad. A list of over 300 shootings. But that was the first documentation in Flint, Michigan, where parents, after that had to ask themselves, was their child truly safe at school? And from 2000 from 2000 to 2007, school shootings were predominantly made up of one-on-one occurrences where maybe there was some bullying or an argument transpired, or there was, something had transpired between students that resulted in gunfire. Those shootings between 2000 and 2007 also consisted of shootings that, self-infliction, the gun going off in the classroom, altercations. It wasn't until 2007 that America was truly shook. April 16th, 2007, in Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech University, 33 students who will forever be missed were unalived. The perpetrator's life also ended that day. 23 students were injured and will never see life the same again. This was the first deadliest shooting that we had to endure and suffer as Americans that forever changed the face of America. December 14th, 2012 is when a mass shooting occurred that took place at Sandy Hook Elementary. The occurrence of school shootings in 2000 already changed Americans drastically. Doors that used to be open are now closed. Schools that required, that you could just walk in, now you need to be buzzed in. Parents started to transfer their students to what they considered to be safer schools. And that could have been based on district, what that school was implementing safety-wise, such as metal detectors. Maybe they actually had security on site, a police officer on duty. And that would, change the parents' decision based on what the district was offering their school as far as safety. Schools and the, board and educators also started implementing risk assessment tactics. I think that the implementation on truly having a psychologist in schools actually became a big thing. Whereas before, we all had a school psychologist. I remember in high school, I went to a school psychologist, and I think that everyone even then thought it was a joke. You were bullied if you went to the school psychologist. People talked about you to their friends because they saw you at the office. It was one thing to be in trouble, but it was another to be at the psychologist's office. That's just not somewhere that you gained popularity for. You were definitely bullied, and you were definitely teased because of that. And maybe you needed to go to see the psychologist because you were being bullied for being gay or teased or whatever, or you were having depression issues. And I'm sure there were signs for, a lot of these shooters that were students. I can't really, speak on the shooters that were adults, even though the study has shown that there were also behaviors that were displayed prior that others, after the fact thought that I could have reported that, or they noticed after the fact. But yeah, most definitely going to, the school psychologist was not something that, was known to be a popular thing. And so now, with everything transpiring, that's becoming more of a prevalent requirement in schools, making sure we have a school psychologist, making sure that we are actually checking on students, checking in with them, looking for those behavioral signs of depression, them pulling away, being alone, or maybe they're overly interactive. You have to consider all the behavioral factors, because if you're overly interactive where it becomes, you look like you're great, but you're bullying others. So that's something that we've all had to consider as whether you're a student yourself, an educator. It's just how we even view schools now, and our education system has had to do a lot of implementation and programs as far as prevention to help assist our teachers and educators feeling safe. And like I said, that could be like a lot of schools are implementing metal detectors. So, and I think that it truly shook America in the instance that these shootings were happening in any neighborhood. It wasn't necessarily occurring in what was considered a low-income neighborhood. These were to be considered normal people. Some of the shooters, or one of the shooters, was the son of a sheriff or a police officer, So henceforth, the background at this point is something that educators, parents have all had to consider. Not necessarily that, maybe you do have a good stable home, but there's other factors that could play into behavioral cues that we can look for. But once again, it's just something that as Americans, we now know that this is something that's happening everywhere. And then we have to create these preventative programs so that we can provide a safe place. Now, it is understood that violence in America, we know, like I said, it's not about status, wealth, or color. At this point, we are seeing that it's about your mental well-being, to include where, we need to now implement laws on gun control. Those are becoming debatable. Should we do mental health screenings? Should we do, just different screenings in general? So that's becoming debatable. And then, where now from May 24th, 2022, that is an incident that occurred at Robb Elementary School. In this instance, a shooter took the lives of 19 students and 2 teachers and wounded 17 students. This shooter was taken down by a responding police officer, and life was also taken. This was the 3rd deadliest shooting in U.S. history. Due to the reoccurrence of school shootings, mental health has become a huge focus. Understanding why these shootings were occurring. Educators themselves ultimately need to be psychologists to help identify behaviors in order to alter or encourage positive behavior. This all leads to the correlations of school shootings, once again, and mental health and our emotional well-being of students and Americans today. The statistics say that more than 1 out of every 10 Americans takes an antidepressant. That includes 4% of all adolescents ages 12 to 17 and more than 20% of women ages 40 to 59. The use of antidepressants, because they can be dangerous, is due to it causing homicidal and suicidal thoughts, is in question. But some would debate that they are necessary, and that's where you have to just make sure you have your doctor and your physicians and you're following up with them daily, especially if you're going to take medication to help with your mental health, because they can have side effects. So some would argue that they're not good, but others would argue that it has saved lives. And I would agree with that, where some are severely depressed and they do have those homicidal and suicidal thoughts, but they were able to seek help. They were able to talk to someone about harming others in a public setting and get the help that they needed. Americans and us as a country and our government implementing more programs where people can seek help has made a difference. So ultimately, once again, the goal is to seek help. We don't know who is affected, who's hurting, who's suffering, and what they're going to do because of that. No matter what people think or what they're going to say, we need to seek help. We need to adjust our mental behavior and reactions to our friends and family when maybe they come to you and they say, hey, I need help. Because our reactions tell everything. And I think that that's something that society has not really accepted. The fact is our reaction to mental health, our reaction to people that suffer. There's, bad things. There's a saying that bad things don't happen to good people. Or you say, this couldn't happen to me, or it only happened to them, because something was wrong with them, and necessarily that's the thinking that has us stuck now with the ideology of mental health and our negative perception of it. When we need to have a positive outlook on it, we need to help others. We need them to seek help so that we can stop gun violence. Recognize the warning signs. Speak up. You have a friend that drew something on a wall at school and stated they're going to kill everyone, or maybe they wrote it down, or whatever the instance may be. There were warning signs, and we didn't say anything. You know, our goal now, we know we're going to try to speak up, because that could save lives. That could get that person the help they need. So, once again, no matter what people think, you know, mental health and our mental health state is very important as adolescents and as youth, because everyone is being affected at this point. There's this stigma, or not, what is the word? Not stigma, but there's this understanding with criminals, right? That, you know, you don't hurt women and children. Well, here we have this day and age, that doesn't even matter anymore. Where schools, churches are supposed to be off limits. Those are supposed to be safe havens. That, I would say, you know, old school value or is no longer applicable. So, you know, so that's why they say, you know, some would argue that some of these school shootings, you know, could have been prevented due to, you know, the fact that, you know, there were some warning signs. So, you know, if you know something, say something. You know, possibly checking on a friend more than what you're used to because they stopped coming to class, or they just talked about buying a gun, and, you know, that's abnormal for them because, you know, maybe they recently said they don't like firearms, but now they have one, and you've noticed their mental health has changed. Someone who's very secretive and private, all of a sudden hiding things in their room. You know, we as parents, we have had to become more intrusive due to the aftermath of school shootings. It's made a lot of parents, you know, think like, I'm checking under the bed, I'm checking under the mattress. You know, we're going back to the days where we used to read our kids' diaries, where we've moved from, oh, they need their privacy. Those things, school shootings have changed our way of thinking to help prevent that by seeing emotional and behavior cues. Now, more than 4,100 students aged 11 to 17 currently sleep 6 hours or less. I think that whether it be our home life or our workload, that sleep deprivation in America, it's a thing where we're staying up late watching TV, YouTube, once again, Instagram, social media, scrolling all through the night, hours and hours and hours. Our students now have their phones with them at all times. So not only is our youth not sleeping, our youth is attached to social media, and it's affecting our mental health. The lack of sleep increases the risk for major depression. And principal investigator Robert Roberts, who has a PhD and is a professor of behavioral sciences in the School of Public Health at the University of Texas Health and Science Center in Houston, states, these results are important because they suggest that sleep deprivation may be a precursor for major depression in adolescents, occurring before other symptoms of major depression and additional mood disorders, said principal investigator Robert Roberts. Ultimately, sleep deprivation is a precursor for major depression in our adolescents, and it also can affect other mood disorders. So, how can we use this behavior to prevent school shootings and violence? Since the increase in school shootings, where there were only 21 publications on school violence, there are now 396 publications. These resources offer guidelines and organizational structures for teachers to use as they approach the issue of school violence prevention. Acknowledging the warning signs as a friend, teacher, parent, or family member, and getting that information to the police if needed. If you feel like it's truly something that can save a life, that this is something worthy of reporting to the police, take it. And maybe you're not sure, do it anyway. So now I would like to go into the best practices and what, a lot has changed since 2000 to 2026. So best practices for our educators would include helping these schools function as educational powerhouses against prejudice and discrimination, which tailors to bullying and mental health. In today's society, being different is accepted, but so is bullying. In 2002, 78% of students reported that kids who are gay or thought to be gay were teased or bullied in their schools and communities. 9 out of 10 teens, which is about 93%, hear other kids use words like fag, homo, dyke, or queer. Even in my current profession that comes across my desk, I see egregious things, discriminatory-wise, bullying-wise, that happen to people every day that they're fighting. And you think that history would allow us to change this. It seems like it's either it grew into a different word. It went from homo to the dyke, or and then transgressed to queer. So improving school violence should start with one's mental health, as I stated before, and their life at home, to include new gun laws, better security in schools, mandatory metal detectors in schools, and all schools should be required to functionally be built of brick and bulletproof windows, which will allow for safer perimeter. Because unfortunately, we don't know when a school shooter will attack. Every school should have a police officer that is trained in school shootings and SWAT, and assigned to every school, no matter what district, no matter what funding they have. This is something that the government should fund and allocate funds for. So in conclusion, our government would need to allocate funding towards the lower risk funding toward lowering the risk of school shooters gaining access to our schools. Funding all schools, regardless of district, as stated. I would like for us all to take a moment to pray for anyone who suffered or has been touched deeply and changed forever by these tragedies and school shootings. Let us pray that no one else results to gun violence in our schools, homes, and communities. Let us pray that anyone suffering from homicidal or suicidal thoughts gets the help they need. Amen. Now, the most troubling thought throughout this entire informative speech regarding school violence is that it's gotten progressively worse. We've gone from having only one deadliest school shooting to having now 3. We've gone from where students are now going into classrooms and hurting other students. And being able to bring these firearms into these schools is what is the most concerning. To truly change gun violence in schools, I think that the totality of what we're doing at home with our family, and whether or not people actually have someone, I think that, and would never sympathize. I would just acknowledge that there are people out here that truly need help, and the warning signs are being overlooked. And we need to focus on our homeless community and our mental health community, furthering, assisting them, creating more programs to help aid, taking away from the stigma of, you know, that of not talking about mental health. We continue to push these programs in schools, in our homes, and pushing our children to talk to us. Pushing our youth and our adolescents to talk to someone. And this is all in hopes that one day, you know, we can decrease these numbers. That we can step away from violence. That we can not necessarily control but mitigate mental health by putting a ban on social media platforms that also promote violence, such as Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. It would be great to say that these platforms are being used for something positive. But unfortunately, right now, it's causing a lot of harm for our youth. The owners of these platforms are not taking the necessary steps to block harmful content. Henceforth, our youth is just being predisposed to, as well as adolescents, to more and more and more violence. It seems like just that's where our social media is being tailored to, and it's causing a greater depression and mental health disorders in our youth. Henceforth, as we see a rise in gun violence, we see a rise in mental health. They are currently rising together. But unfortunately, the acknowledgement of mental health is the issue. Acknowledging that we have this problem in our schools and it's not being worldly addressed. All our schools need a police officer. All our schools need metal detectors. This should be a mandatory law. No, we cannot stop someone from walking up, but we can better protect our students, our kids in these schools with funding. If we can fund basketball players, if we can fund the NFL, then we can find a way to fund what matters most, which is our teachers, our educators, and our police department. Our doctors are paid. Our anyone with a PhD is currently high valued and paid high salary. Our teachers and our police force at this point need to be compensated just as much because they now face a different hazard in their field than they did before. They currently now just don't go to school to teach. If I was a teacher, I would have to go to school to assess, learn my students, care enough to see the signs, the difference in their behavior in my students. And we all know that not all teachers are there to care. Some of them are there to teach because they get 3 months off. They're not there for your student necessarily, or they're underpaid, underworked, and they are just tired. Or there's not enough funding in the district, so maybe they just don't have the teachers they need. But one thing that we can do to prevent school gun violence is changing the gun laws, putting better restrictions on it, and putting more money and funding into our schools. The same funding that we put into the NFL, our basketball players, entertainment, and other entities, we need to put that into what matters. Why is it that only our doctors and certain professions are paid at six-figure salaries, but teachers are capped at $40,000? Officers are capped at $60K. You have to be an officer, but now know that you just have to respond to this, and not that it's not. I don't think maybe it's the fear of the gunfire, because a police officer joined knowing that they would have to use, their firearm or protect others. I believe it's being in that position, and even just the aftermath, I think shakes America, and it shook our police force, it shook our teachers, and how we see everything. It changed the amount of people who want to become teachers. It changed public education. And this is in an area where now you see a rise in online school. Whereas people frowned upon those who homeschooled. They were bullied. They were viewed as weird. Oh, you're homeschooled. I mean, I remember, teased, being bullied just because I grew up in Germany, or just because I was or am African American, and my speech isn't necessarily tailored or does not come across as the way of my other people that I may know. Back then, it just wasn't something that was predominant, where you were teased for being smart. So our focus definitely needs to be on mental health and gun laws and screening, and maybe stricter assessments on like I said, mental health requirements for gun laws. There's so much that we could do to prevent this. Like I said, to include bolstering our schools and giving them greater safety. I've driven up to many schools just to see. During this time, I did I wanted to see for myself what safety was being implemented at my local schools, for example. So I drove around and I looked at different schools. For example, there's one school. There's a lot of schools right now that are so full. They have these trailers that sit outside from the school. So you have the main building, which is brick, and then you have a trailer that sits there. So I pull up. I have a kid. And I'm just viewing, how is this school safe? If I were to enroll my child here, and at the time, I had surveyed this school for that main purpose, but I also included this school in my research because it was also a personal experience. So I go up there, and I'll actually just go ahead and discuss this school first and the personal experience. So I go to the school to enroll my child, and immediately when I pull up, it's a U-shape. So when you pull in, it's a U-shape. So a parent would drive their car in and drop their kid off. The first safety risk that I noticed was that the drop-off point is directly by the main street traffic. So here's the road where you have all the traffic. Parents can either turn into that U-shape this way, and then they exit the other way. Either way, they are on the main street. It's not pushed back. You don't drive into a parking lot first and go back to the school with pickup areas. It is directly by the main street. So that was the first warning sign. Second, the school is so full that they have now put fourth graders in, like I said, these, they're called like little shacks. And even though the school is up to sixth grade, I was curious as to why would you put fourth graders outside who are less mature than the sixth graders. I also inquired on the bathroom policy and what was the policy for the kids walking from the outside port shacks to the main building. They said, oh, they do a buddy system. To me, that's another safety risk because the kids are now out there unattended, and they did not have a teacher that stands out there all day, just maybe one person, or security. They had zero security, not one person standing out there to protect the children as they walk to the other building, which they could have, not even just being fearful of a school shooting, they could have been kidnapped from someone just coming up the main street. The other issue was when I went around the building to see what security was provided with cameras. Well, the little shack that the students were in, that's like a trailer, there weren't any cameras. The one that they professed was a camera was on the back wall, which faced a park, a walkway. There were no cameras towards the street. There were no cameras towards the main building. So that left the back unsecure sides and the front. The building also did not have security or cameras. There were no security. There was not a fence to encase the trailer to protect the students from public traffic. The fourth grader was just off by themselves. So to me alone, and including the trailer, was just unsecure, leaving them vulnerable to a school shooter versus, the students in the building, you have to buzz to get in and all that. You put these students in a trailer. Now these students lose the safety and protection of the brick building. They lose the safety and protection of being able for parents buzzing in and out, because these students are in a trailer. And we know what the trailers are made of, that material that is very thin, and it's just not protected for the student. There's no barrier to protect them, the students or the teacher. So that personal experience alone just woke me. It shook me, because I wouldn't have even been thinking of these things if there wasn't school shootings in our communities. I literally had to think of these things as I was deciding what school I wanted to choose. And I did not choose that school because when I had this discussion with the principal of how I felt as if the school was not secure enough and they're not considering these factors, one, they didn't take me seriously. That one of the teachers laughed. They thought it was funny. And so that to me was just a huge decision maker. There was nothing else to consider that I needed to even think about in regards to choosing a school. So that was one experience. I drove to a couple other schools. Once again, some were more secure than others. And just being a parent, having to choose, I can see and see how unsafe these schools are now at this point. But, all in all, school violence can truly, be prevented with more mental health awareness.